Hey everyone, Rose here, and welcome back to another Blender video. It's almost Christmas, so I decided to make something a bit holiday themed, and I eventually went for my character Luna. Some of you might recognize her, I've sculpted her before a couple of times, and I decided to make a full body of her this time and holding a sphinx cat. I shared a couple of work in progress pictures while I was working on her over on Discord, and several people said the cat looked like Bingus, so I just kind of went with it, and it's Bingus now. With that out of the way, on with a time lapse. To start out, I add a bit of a base from a cylinder. I end up changing that later on, so it's not so important. Now I move on to the body. I add two spheres, which I shape a little bit in sculpt mode to make the torso. Then I add a skin modifier setup for the limbs. That's just a simple wireframe with a skin modifier and subdivision surface modifier. Then I add two more spheres for the head and neck and just sculpt that for a bit to make sure the shape works. From here I go into the limbs and add a little bit more detail to them by making parts thicker and thinner. At this point, to keep the object symmetrical, I have a mirror modifier on them with a mirror object set to the body so that they're flipped around that. Now I make her hands from a sphere with a skin modifier set up again for the fingers. And now I make the boots. At first I try and just sculpt them, but I end up also using a skin modifier setup for them. This is a bit of a running theme, especially in the beginning of the model, but I found using skin modifiers is very useful for getting a general idea of the shape, even if occasionally you get small glitches. I had blocked in some ears earlier, but I make those into earmuffs since you won't actually see the ears in the finished sculpt. At this point I decide to break up the model into a kind of basic rig. I break up the limbs into individual pieces and make sure all the origins are in the spot where the joint would be. Then I parent them together. I used a very similar setup for last week's video, which was the dragon figurine I sculpted. If you haven't seen that video, definitely go check that out. I ran into a bit of an issue while uploading it, and a lot of people didn't end up seeing it because of that. And it's a bummer because I put quite a bit of time into it. Anyway, for that sculpt, the setup was even more useful because the dragon was kind of skeletal, meaning I didn't even have to end up merging the shapes together later. I could just essentially pose him with this rig setup and then leave him like that. But it's still very useful for posing a model like this. Now I do the bottom of her coat, which I model from a cube with a mirror modifier and subdivision surface modifier. And now I delete the bottom and top and add a solidify modifier. I also duplicate the top of the earmuffs that I just made using my same skin modifier setup and use that to shape the fuzzy edge of the hood. Now I add in a sphere, and with dynamic topology turned on, I quickly sculpt it into the basic blockout shape of the hair. And now, with a couple of more fixes to the proportions and stuff, it's finally time to move on to the face. I start with the overall shape of the head, with the cheeks and brows and eye sockets and such, and then I go in and add features like the nose, eyes and lips. I add in the eyeballs as spheres with a mirror modifier, and then duplicate them and add a solidify modifier and use that for the eyelids. I go in and keep adding more details. Occasionally I remesh in order to get a bit more resolution. You'll notice throughout the sculpt I revisit the face quite a lot. Faces are quite hard to sculpt, especially because just making a couple of minor tweaks can make the face look like a completely different person, which is kind of annoying, especially when you aren't 100% sure how the character is supposed to look. And now back to the hair. I grab 2 more spheres, and again using dynamic topology, I sculpt them into the general shape of the hair. Now for Luna, all the pieces are in place, so I go back to the limbs, remove all the mirror modifiers, then I duplicate them but using Alt-D instead of Shift-D to create a linked copy, and mirror them over to the other side. Now I can pose the model asymmetrically, but when I sculpt on a particular piece, the changes carry over to the other side. With the pose in place, I finally start on the cat. I add a sphere and shape that into a very rough blob for the body. I have a couple of references open of people holding cats, and you really can't see that much outside of the head and the front paws, so for the most part just having a rough blob with a tail is enough for the body shape. Now I add in a sphere and 2 more, or rather 1 with a mirror modifier, and from that I sculpt the face and ears. I remeshed them to a pretty high resolution already to begin with, and just quickly make the shapes. I didn't have nearly as much trouble with the cat's face as I did with Luna's face. I add in the eyeballs again and the eyelids exactly the same way I did for Luna. Now I add in a sphere for a quick neck. Here I grab another piece of skin modifier and use it to shape out the 2 paws sticking over the arm. Now I move back to the body and duplicate that and make him a sweater. Since I'm changing the shape a lot, I use dynamic topology instead of remeshing. At this point I added materials just to be able to see which object is which and what belongs together a bit more clearly. I add 2 different objects to all the eyes, so that way I can also see in which direction they're looking. Originally I had made the cat's eyes green, but a couple of people mentioned he looked like Bingus, so I made them blue, so now he's Bingus. I also go into edit mode on the hands and pose them so that they look like they're holding the cat a bit more. I'll do more of that later once I unlink the 2 sets of fingers. Now I move down to the boots. I originally wanted to just sculpt them from the skin modifier setup I had made, but that really wasn't working out, so I end up modeling them. I add in a cube with a subdivision surface modifier and then extrude it and add edge loops and just go around modeling it until I'm happy with the shape. I have a couple of boots very similar to the ones I gave her, which was good because I could use those as reference. Just like how I did it with the coat, I remove the tops of the shoes and add a solidify modifier to give them thickness. Now I duplicate a piece of the top and use that to form the furry edge. I also modeled some laces, though I lost part of the footage for that. Now I go back up to the face to add some details and make a couple of adjustments. Now I start on the eyelashes. I add an object, merge it down to a single vert, and then extrude it along the edge of the eye. And add a solidify modifier and extrude it out until I have the general shape of the eyelashes. Do the same for the bottom. And then I move back to a bit of sculpting. Now I add in another object and quickly sculpt a scarf. I also duplicate a piece of the fur to add a bit more to the hood. At this point I decide I'm fully happy with the pose, so I unlink all the objects and then merge all the pieces back together. Technically I could have left them together from the beginning, but having them as separate objects made it a lot easier to pose it around, especially considering there were still other objects parented to the ends. Now I duplicate a bit of the coat and make a set of pockets. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I wasn't really happy with this starter base, so I added a kind of clump of snow on top of it, and I make a couple more changes to it later. And back to the face for some more tweaks. I was a bit unsure how I wanted her hair to be, but I eventually decided I wanted it to just hang over the hood. Here I add a bit more detail to the eyelashes. And it's finally time for the hair. I had a lot of fun using NURBS for the hair on my Galaxy Girl character, so I did it again here for Luna. I add a Bezier circle to control the bevel of the curve, and then adjust the shapes and direction in edit mode, using Alt S to adjust the thickness. I also make a second set of hair with its own bevel object to make smaller detail strands. With one part of the hair done, I move back to Bingus. I merge all the objects from his head together and remesh them and start sculpting a bit more, adding some of the wrinkles and smaller details that his face is still missing. I found it quite hard to strike a proper balance with Bingus, since Sphinx cats are so wrinkly and kind of have very sharp corners and stuff in their face. It's hard to make them look friendly, but he's supposed to look very nice and friendly, so I had a bit of trouble figuring out like how many wrinkles he should have and how sharp I should make edges and stuff like that. And with him done, I move back up to the hair. I make a couple more tweaks and move stuff around on the side I had already finished, and then move on to the other side. I just duplicate a piece and flip it over and start working from there. Now I go over to my little detail hairs and duplicate them over to the other side for that too. Now I make a final tweak to the pose, having her look up in a similar direction to the cat. And now I move on to the back hairs. I can't really do that before I adjust the pose, otherwise I'd have to adjust all the hairs again, and that would be a bit of a pain. I kept the back hairs as a separate object just to make it a bit easier to navigate. I make some more tweaks to the blocking I did for the hair in the back. I'm going to use it later on to be essentially a guide for where to put the curves. Around about this point I decided I want to model most of the coat, so I duplicate a piece of the bottom for the top and model that in the same way. So that way later on I can just apply the mirror modifiers and merge the two together. And now I finally go back to the hair. I duplicate pieces and just keep extruding them out and aligning them with the blocking I'd made, and just tweaking and pulling and pushing things around until I'm happy with how they look. You'll probably notice I move around a lot while sculpting. I don't really do one thing and finish it. I found it quite helpful to take a step back from particular parts every once in a while, especially when I get a bit stuck, and just do something else for a while and then come back to it later, and usually that helps to figure stuff out. Now I go in again and add some of my detail strands along the back and the sides. Now that I'm pretty much done with the hair, I go back to the coat. I make a couple of more tweaks to the top and then apply the mirror modifiers and merge the two pieces together. And then in edit mode, I just go around and make sure they're connected properly and the transition looks good. Now it's time to start detailing. I need to figure out the fur texture, which I'm going to use for the boots and the edge of the coat, as well as the earmuffs, so I start with the earmuffs. I mess around for quite a while trying to figure out what works. Eventually I figure something out that works. I start by drawing on essentially small strands of hair with the draw brush, then I use the sharpen mesh filter on them, then I remesh, and then I use the randomize filter just to finish up with a fluffy texture. Now we move to the hands. I unlink the two objects and now I essentially give them the final pose and make sure they wrap around everything correctly. I also remesh Bingus' sweater and add a bit more detail there. Then I added a couple more wrinkles and details onto his face. Now it's time to finish up the hands. I mess around for a while trying to figure out the best possible way to merge the two pieces together. Eventually I just kind of remesh them as I usually would. Now I go in to sculpt the final details. Since she's wearing gloves, I don't need to add the usual creases and stuff that you would usually see on hands, and I can just go in and make sure it looks kind of like a thickish, woolly texture that you would find on a glove. I used the random mesh filter a lot during the sculpt, especially for the woolly parts. It just makes them feel a bit softer and more woolly. Now I start working on getting the coat into one piece. I apply the skin modifiers to the sleeves and then join them with the main body of the coat, and then work towards carefully merging and pushing and pulling around bits until the sleeve is properly connected to the body. And I do the same thing over on the other side. Now I just go around making a couple more tweaks until everything looks about right, and I duplicate a small piece of the edge to kind of imply a zipper. And now I'm back working on the face, again adding some more details and creases and pushing and pulling things around, trying to get her to kind of look the way I imagine her. Now I make Bingus's little paws. Sphinx cats have really weird looking paws just because they have no fur, so it took a bit of messing around to get them to look hairless but not super weird and off-putting. I liked how the one I'd already made looked, so I just duplicated that over and flipped it to make the other one. And more stuff on the face. This time I wasn't really super happy with the size of the eyes, so I messed around and scaled them and moved them apart a bit. I also messed around with her eyelashes to make them a bit more subtle. Here I add a bit of texture to the scarf the same way I did the earmuffs. And I do the same thing for the furry edge of the boots. I notice her forehead is a bit weirdly small, so I move up her hair a bit and resize her head and stuff to make it look a bit better. And now I do the texture for the fur on the coat. I also remesh Bingus' sweater and give that a bit of a woolly texture using the random filter again. Now it's finally time to make the coat look like one of these puffy, downy jackets, which is how I want it to look. I apply all the modifiers except the subdivision surface modifier, and then I try and mess around with multi-res, though that doesn't really work how I want it to, so I end up just adding and applying the subdivision surface modifier anyway. In edit mode, I just grab a couple of edges and select them where I want the seams to be. And then in sculpt mode, I make everything into one face set and then select face sets by edit mode selection. Then I mask the face sets I've made and use the inflate filter to kind of fill them up and make this kind of puffy effect. I originally wanted to use the cloth filters, but I couldn't really get those to look the way I wanted, so I just went for the regular inflate. I also move the pockets a bit so that they actually stick out and aren't buried inside the fluff. Then back in sculpt mode on the jacket, I just add a couple more creases and smooth out some edges until it looks the way I want it to. The original inflate left a couple of weird hard edges which don't really make sense for this kind of jacket. And now back to some tweaks to the face. And now it's finally time to start painting. For those of you who don't know where to find the Sculpt Mode Vertex Paint tools, they're only available in the alphas, and you have to go into Preferences, turn on Developer Options, then you'll find the tab Experimental at the very bottom, and there you can turn on Tools Without Icons and Sculpt Mode Vertex Colors. Anyway, on with the coloring. I start with the eyes, I mask out the parts I want colored in edit mode, and then just add the color. For the face, I start by filling everything in with a basic skin tone, and then going around with some slight pinks and something slightly purplish to add some blush to the cheeks and nose, and just add a bit more interest and make the colors look a bit more lively. I also apply the modifiers on the brows and lashes and paint those in a dark grey. Now for Bingus, I merge all the objects together to make it a bit easier, then I fill everything in with a light pink. I mess around with some darker colors that some sphinxes have, but eventually I decide to just go with pink. I mix in some darker and lighter shades to emphasize wrinkles and just add a bit more variation until I'm happy with how he's looking. Outside of the meme of Bingus, I actually need a proper name for Luna's Sphinx cat, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. His eyes were a bit more complicated to paint, unlike Luna's, because his pupils aren't completely round. So I eventually modeled kind of a pupil shape for him, and then used knife project to project it onto his eye, and then messed around with the topology a bit until I had something that I could essentially then use as a base to paint his eyes. The whole process took quite a while, but eventually I got something out that I really liked, so it was worth it. For the coat, I just filled it in with a very dark grey, and then went in around the creases to just add a bit of a darker shade just to give it a bit more depth. The boots were fairly straightforward, I just filled them in with a dark color. For the fur on the boots, I also used the dirty vertex mask and the color filters just to add a bit more depth and make the deeper points a bit darker and the sticky outy bits a bit lighter. I did the same thing for the fur around the top. Here I also remove the wooden part of the base and just leave a small patch of snow for her to stand on. For the gloves, I fill them in a basic blue color and then I paint a little snowflake on them. At first the white is a bit too bright, so I dull it down by adding a bit of the blue over the top. Then I copy the whole thing over to the other gloves and add a couple of stripes and stuff just to make the gloves feel a bit more patterned. I also add a couple of stripes to the scarf. Now for her leggings. I paint a bunch of stripes onto them to kind of divide it into several sections, and then I add dots and little patterns and flowers and Christmas trees in between them just to make like a fun pattern that's kind of similar to a Christmas sweater. And then I copy the whole pattern over to the other leg. And now the cat sweater. I add some stripes in green to it to kind of make it into several sections to work with again, similar to how I did with the leggings. And then I start adding some patterns. I messed around with some cats at the bottom, but I didn't really like how they were looking, so I removed it and then filled it in with white and added some pine trees. And at the top I added some Christmas tree ornaments. I wanted the whole thing to kind of really look like one of these typical ugly sweaters. I kind of realized that compared to the other elements, the leggings were a bit too low resolution, so I subdivided the mesh a bit more and then blurred the original thing I'd painted and went over it with a bit of blue again, and then I just kind of repainted the whole pattern over again. And with all that done, it's finally time to add some materials. For the most part, I just plug my vertex colors into the principled shader and mess around with some subsurface scattering, as well as the roughness. For the hair, I use a gradient texture and some noise textures to add a bit of transparency to the end, and I make the general material a bit metallic, and also add a bit of a bump map based on a noise texture again that's kind of mapped along the curve of the hair, and that all just makes the whole texture and surface feel a bit more like hair and less like just kind of long meshes. There's a really good video about making and shading hair like this. I'd really recommend taking a look at it. I'll link it up in the card. For the lighting, I just use my usual setup. For the background, I find a nice image of like a nicely lit wintry scene with a bunch of lights and stuff, and I stick that in the background. I try and figure out a way to blur it within Blender, but I couldn't get that to work, so I just export it into Krita and blur it there. For the woolly materials, I also added a noise texture for the bump and turned it up pretty high, which gave the whole thing a very soft kind of woolly feel, especially in combination with subsurface scattering. I make a couple more tweaks to the whole lighting and rendering setup and different materials and stuff off camera, but there was just a lot of back and forth and tweaking, so I didn't bother to record that all. One last fun thing I did was make snow. I added a plane and gave it an emission particles system, and then I modeled a couple of snowflakes, put them in a collection, and then used those as the snow. It took a bit of messing around and tweaking and adding some force fields and stuff like that, but eventually I got something I really liked. And with that, this sculpt is done. And here's the finished model. I really like how they turned out, and I had a lot of fun making them. I also tried out a couple of tools and techniques I haven't used much before, so I learned a bit of something new in the process. And I hope you guys also got something out of it. If you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy some of my other recent sculpts, which will pop up on the screen right about now. Otherwise, feel free to like and subscribe. Also, if you have any suggestions for a name for the cat other than Bingus, feel free to leave that in the comments below. Anyway, that's all from me for today. I wish all of you guys happy holidays, be that Christmas or anything else you might be celebrating, and see you all next time.